education so that you realize that designing a legal system is not a trivial job. It's in fact a very, very difficult, complicated, sophisticated project, and there's no reason to expect a government to be competent in doing it. But in the system I'm describing, the legal system is being designed by private firms with ordinary profit motives. That if my court can write a legal system that most people like to be under, then it can get lots of enforcement agencies to agree to use it as a court, because that way they are providing their customers with a product they like, and therefore you've got a competitive market for generating law. That's the basic sketch of the system. And I am sure that any of you who are sufficiently sensible not to believe things that speakers tell you can think of lots of reasons why it won't work. And if this talk were entirely on that, I would deal with some of them. But instead, as I say, if you go up on my webpage, one of the things you will find is The Machinery of Freedom, my first book, webbed as a free PDF. I did get my publishers, given that they weren't actually publishing it anymore, to agree to let me at least web it. Eventually I'll get another edition out, produce that. So in that I attempt to answer at least most of the obvious arguments for why such a system would work. And I think I should stop about now, both so that we get comments and so that we'll have a little time left for people to ask questions, because the nice thing about answering questions is that when you're answering a question, you know there's at least one person in the room who's interested in what you're talking about.
I won't take much time because I'm more interested in how you all react to this. I have a couple of thoughts on this, and obviously it covered a lot of ground, and so I'm only going to take bits and pieces of it. But as far as the three sort of topics here, the property example, I think there's one issue there which you touched on later on when you talk about norms, but the idea of private property being essentially enforced in these scenarios where there is no law, where you have the person jumping trash in the other person's yard, or the person who shovels out his snow for his parking spot. I think that the reason that they might have private property sort of enforced without government in those situations is not just because of this fear of the fight to the death, but also because there's legitimacy in those property rights, which is in this case privately generated, at least in the Chicago example with the snow. A lot of reasons why you don't steal that person's parking spot is not because you're afraid to have your window busted when you get back, but because you respect the fact he's done the work, and you know this is something that's legitimate, he owns that spot. And same thing, when your neighbor says, I'm going to dump my garbage on your lawn, if you believe that you have the right to this property and no one has the right to dump garbage on it, probably a lot of other people believe that too, and it will deter people from actually dumping garbage on other people's property. His legitimacy in part comes from the state, and one thing the state does provide is legitimacy. As long as the government's legitimate, then the government sits out property rights and says these people deserve this property, these people deserve this property. That's going to make most people agree with that and respect your property rights without worrying about the fight to the death. So I think by taking away, the norms don't always just privately develop. I think they also develop through government enforcing them and people believing what the government says. And I think that's a benefit the government gives you with property rights that you would lose if you didn't have a government to imbue property rights with that legitimacy. The contract I thought was fascinating. I'd love it certainly as an exercise for contract design, and I think that would be something any contract student would want to do. Write a contract assuming there's no way to enforce it. What better way to write a contract? Once your contract has to go to court to be enforced, I agree, you've lost, you failed. You don't want to write a contract that you think is going to go to court. You want one that's going to stay out of court. I do think that, again, some of these, the reputational enforcement, for example, assumes, if not perfect information transfer, then very good information transfer among people with different reputation. The reputation is known to others. If you don't have to worry about your reputation, because you're going to a different city or because it's simply not good information transfer about your dealings, then that's going to break down. But I think that's why, we talk about the internet, and when eBay has its rating system, they're trying to increase the information transfer, make sure everyone knows, here's your reputation. You have this percentage of good reviews and so on. I think that's very useful, and obviously you want to ensure that people's reputation is disseminated widely for that. I do have a concern, and I'm sure you've heard this before, about parties with disparate negotiating abilities or resources or economic power when you're making these contracts. I think And the third way to design the contract so if he wants to challenge it is terrific if you have two parties with equal abilities to make these negotiations and to bring attorneys or negotiators that sort of know what they're doing. That's obviously not always the case with contracts. I'd be worried about one side taking advantage of the other by writing a contract in such a way that's easy for them to breach. The other side is not able to, not savvy enough or doesn't have enough resources to essentially be able to fight against that. And you might get some one-sided contracts that way. But those are, I do think that those are relatively trivial thoughts here compared to the idea of being able to design a contract in that way. I think it's a great thought. Not surprisingly, I have the most to say about the last idea, this idea of law without government, essentially law enforcement without government. I think that's a little bit more problematic. What would it be like in society if you had private property but no government to enforce it? I'm not sure how that would work. A couple of thoughts. One is who would have the best private security? If you have many different people with their own private security firms defending their property, we don't have the police, who are at least in theory supposed to protect everyone equally. You have private firms that are disparate quality depending on how much money the property owner might have. In one sense, this might be a good thing. I can see a libertarian argument saying, well, if your property is very productive, you make a lot of money, you can hire the best firm and protect that very productive property. If you're doing property poorly, then you can't hire a very good firm and you get sort of overwhelmed by the better private armies that can now use the more productive property to get better private forces. And the less productive land and property and businesses are sort of literally taken over and put to better use by those who are better at it. I'm worried, though, with the idea, if there are any public goods left in this world, maybe there are. Maybe we privatize everything. But if we don't, we have public schools, public hospitals, and public post office. Do they have to pay for their own security? And if so, how could they possibly defend themselves in this kind of situation? And maybe the response is to privatize everything, schools and hospitals and postal delivery and everything else. And then, the best run schools defend themselves and the others can't. But if we want to live in a world where we do have public goods like that, I think it's going to be problematic to simply depend on private security. And another comment is the incentive structure for these private security firms. They don't respond to what the public wants, they respond to what their client wants. And to take it sort of a more concrete example of this, again, as we don't have a world without any kind of law enforcement at all, we do have plenty of private security firm, private police these days. In fact, they outnumber public police by about 2 or 3 to 1 in our country. And what the private police decide to do is sometimes at odds with what is in the public good. It's always what their clients want. They work for the client. But police have a lot of, both private and public police have a lot of discretion in law enforcement. How do they exercise that discretion? In public police should, in theory, exercise it in the public good. They decide to make an arrest, where they decide to put their resources, and private firms won't necessarily do so. The best example I have is general deterrence. You all remember criminal law and the reasons you have criminal law in the first place. You have deterrence and retribution, incapacitation, and so on. A private police force working for a private client won't care about general deterrence. They don't care about making sure that someone's actually arrested, apprehended, and incapacitated and punished. They care about specific deterrence. Make sure my client is not the one who is going to be a victim of a crime again. So they'll make sure their client is well protected, but they don't have any concept of any incentive to do general deterrence. They have no, as long as they can get rid of the criminal, push them on down the line to the next person, to the next victim, they're as satisfied as if they can deter that person wholeheartedly. People who know law enforcement know it's very easy to stop drugs from being sold in one location. If you want, if one neighborhood is rich enough to hire private security and kick the drugs out of that block, that's pretty easy. Public police have to decide how to get the drugs out of every single block in the city. It's much harder, it requires different strategies, different resource allocation. And we're here again, you just have people kicking the crime down the road, so you'd have, the crime would still exist, it would just exist in other areas, which is not necessarily best for society. And finally, it seems to me that, and I'm curious how this would happen, but in this idea of private property without law, it seems like we're essentially recreating the state, ultimately. The state's going to evolve through these mechanisms that were described. We'll have, we already talked about private courts coming into being, and after the private courts will come private laws. And groups of private firms and private parties get together and say, look, there's no point relitigating these each time. We'll put together some kind of compact to describe our rights under private property, describe our the rights that we have when we're accused of a crime. We'll make sure we go to the same private court to have consistency. And all of a sudden you have de facto a state. It might have been derived by market principles and be better, but eventually you're going to create